Welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
John, thank you for joining me on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's good to see you. It's been a little while since we've talked, but we made it happen, right?
Yeah, it's awesome to be here.
So you are at Crux Collaborative. Can you give me a little brief history of sort of how Crux became Crux Collaborative and the type of work you do these days?
Sure. Crux Collaborative is a user experience consulting firm, so that's where we focus. We started in about the year 2000, and actually my wife, Emily Eaton, started the business at that time as a usability practitioner. And a few years later, I joined up with her and we started a company called Eaton Golden because it was Emily Eaton and John Golden. Mm-hmm. And then a few years later, or a number of years later, Emily decided to leave the business. I always say Emily left the business. She didn't leave me. And we took on a partner, Mahtab Rizai, and Mahtab and I started Crux Collaborative together. Didn't make any sense to have it be called Eaton Golden anymore because there was no Eaton. Right. So fast forward today, Mahtab actually recently left the business, and now I'm the sole owner of it. And we focus on user experience consulting, so we do a lot of user research. We do usability testing, strategic work for UX, documentation, design work, that sort of thing. We build a lot of prototypes. Typically, the work that we do tends to be behind the login, a lot of software application work, or most of our clients are in regulated industry, financial services, medical benefits, those types of things.
Very cool. Well, I'm really glad to have you here today because I want to talk about all things user research, and I'm sure we'll touch on a number of other subjects. But one thing that I've heard from people that we work with as clients and things is sometimes the idea of going and actually talking to people is kind of scary, and how to actually make that happen is even scarier. So from your opinion, I've talked to folks where they say, well, I've got tons of analytics. I've got tons of data. That will tell me kind of where people are excited about using things and where they're not excited about using things. So how do you counter that argument where people are saying kind of like, well, the analytics sort of tell me the story I need. Why do I need to go and waste a bunch of money talking to people?
Yeah, we deal with that question a lot, actually. In my opinion, the analytics tell you part of the story. It certainly can give you a trend, and it certainly can give you a lot of information about what people are currently using and that sort of thing on the site. But if something isn't findable, if something isn't easy for somebody to do, sometimes they'll go to a page and then not actually see the thing that they were supposed to go there to see in the first place. Right. So what we tend to do is like to use the analytics as to form an initial hypothesis about what there might be a problem or an issue or something that would want to gain more attention, functionality that might not work properly, that sort of thing for a specific audience. And then what we like to do is recruit people that are specific to that audience to then ask them some questions and see how they naturally would use the application in order to determine whether or not the analytics are giving us the right information. Then what we like to do too is establish analytics as a benchmark, because then later on we can go back and do another report down the road when things have changed to see how the analytics perform differently.
And how do you get started though? Like, let's say I'm listening to this show and I'm new to this idea of asking people, right, about how to use my product or service or things like that. Before I go and hire a place like Crux to come in and help me, what are some of the initial things that you hope people are doing?
Well, we hope that they have a pretty good understanding about who they're trying to sell to, if they're trying to sell something to someone on using a website or application, or if they're trying to complete a critical process or some sort of process. So we really want to understand what are the attributes of those users or those people that would come to the site. So basically what we want to do is we want to understand who they are, what they want to do. Lots of times when we do a strategic session to understand that, we'll think about it in terms of what are the things that they want to do, what do they want to read, if that's applicable on a site, and maybe what are the things that they would want to share with others. Okay. So we kind of start with those three categories of things, and that helps to try to determine the functionality and what might provide the most value to them.
Got it.
So if our clients have a pretty good understanding of what that is and who those people are in the beginning, it makes a huge difference in terms of us trying to understand what processes would resonate with them.
Got it. And so let's talk about the other things I can do besides user research, right? So a thing that's become popular in the last few years is things like design sprints, where we're just racing to get some sort of prototype thing and putting it in front of people. And some people I know in the industry have sort of replaced traditional sort of user research processes with these sort of design sprints or proof of concept things, and get something in somebody's hands and all that before spending tons of time. How have you found that balance successful for you?
One of the things that we've noticed over the course of the last couple of years or a few years is that when people talk about a usability test, so there's user research and there's a usability test. And I think there's a big distinction between what those things are. A usability test is traditionally you'd go in and look at an application that exists and then try to find out ways where it's successful and where it fails. And then look for ways to improve that or leave it as is. Okay. When we do user research, it's a little bit different. Is we're looking for less about what works and what doesn't work. So less about a process and more about a concept. So trying to understand, does the concept resonate with the person that's using it? So in this case, a lot of times what we do is we do prototype testing of things. So when we work with a company or with a development team that does work in Agile, lots of times what we'll do is at the end of a specific sprint, we'll do a check-in with them. Okay. So it's a much less formal way of testing where we could even establish a panel of respondents that could regularly come and test. For contextual, sometimes we'll go out in the field and talk to people if they're using something that's like an application on top of a building or something like that. We've done that in the past where we had an interface that was like a heating, cooling interface, HVAC interface, and the interface needed to be used on top of a building, out in the cold, in the snow, all of that sort of thing. So it created some challenges, and that's not something that you're going to get a really good idea about how somebody's going to interact with that in a controlled research environment. We need to be out in the field to look at that.
For sure. How do you balance that in that sort of sprint mentality where you're doing more, people are building while you're researching?
Yeah, I think what we like to do is get out a little bit in front of it. Okay. So we're
how far would you say?
Well, it sort of depends on the team, but I would say one sprint out in front, at least one sprint out in front. So what we like to try to do is then they'll give us some feedback. We might have a point in time where we stop and do an informal check-in with them. So we could bring in some people to do that, ask them a few questions, takes a day. So in one day, basically what we end up with is we bring the people in, we ask them some questions, we observe what they do, and then we have actionable results after that. Okay.
So one of the other challenges that I've found with people that they're trying to do some research, and I think there's two areas where wires get crossed in organizations, is that there's market research and then there's user research. So sometimes when I'm speaking to groups about like how we should build some sort of proto personas to sort of start the conversation, they're like, no, we have all the client info. Can you just take that market research and just apply it to your user research and call it a day? Wouldn't that be nice?
It would be nice if you could do it that way.
You can't. Is what
well, I think that again, and one of the things that we often get asked, when we talk about a usability test or user research typically will do one-on-one. So it's in-depth interviews. Lots of times they call it that. Even when we get requests, people will still call it a focus group, and a focus group is more than, it's a group of people that are looking at something to evaluate it. Right. So I think in that context, for market research, you can get a pretty good idea of what's, whether a concept's going to resonate with them or whether they're going to like what they're seeing. That sort of thing is for market research. But the idea of getting one-on-one with somebody and letting them work through a series of tasks, work through a process, understand how something is going to work and apply to the way that they would use it in their regular life is a little bit different, because you're seeing what we like to do is to be able to connect with them, see their body language, how they're responding to something. You can pick up a lot on how somebody, sits back in their chair, how they, if they roll their eyes when they see something. And so we can ask better questions about that.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about, how do you create those questions? Is it always the same kind of questions? Is it always something different? One of the things that I hear a lot is the importance of not leading the witness, right? With would you like to use this? Or so how have you found the best way to sort of craft those questions up front? Is there kind of a formula and then you apply sort of the context that the organization is, or how does that work?
Well, I like to say I've gotten really good at answering questions with questions. It drives my 15-year-old son nuts since I ask him questions.
And this is why I love having UX people on the show, because many times when I ask a question, they say, well, it depends. It's kind of the standard answer.
Yeah.
Right?
No, it's sort of like, if somebody lots of times a respondent or a participant in a session will ask a question about something. Well, is it supposed to work this way? And then what I will often say to them is, is that what you would expect it to do?
Okay.
So what we don't want to do is lead them. Now, what I also like to do is I kind of like to freelance a little bit off the test plan sometimes, especially if somebody brings up a subject that is, would provide some business value that we hadn't thought about. Because lots of times, and I think one of the best things about doing this type of user research is that things surface that we didn't know. So it's sort of that you don't know what you don't know. Even though we're usability experts, there's still things that surface that we learn new all the time about how an application is structured or put together.
So again, back to kind of what I was saying before I call Crux, maybe I want to do some upfront sort of my own user research, right? Maybe I'm a small company and I want to do some of this myself, right? Or I'm a startup and
Sure.
I want to start to talk to people. What's a good formula for creating that sort of first, script?
Well, I think the best place to start is to start with a series of questions that you would want answered as a result of the research. So that's typically how we would do it is we would establish some research objectives, and they're usually in the format of a question. What do we want to gain from doing this research? So is it understanding whether the application is intuitive? Is it understanding whether they can complete a specific task? Is it understanding whether or not the overall concept design is resonating with them, that sort of thing. So we usually establish about, I would say, 8 to 10 research objectives, very high level objectives. And then what we would do is build a test plan around that would then be more in-depth questions that would solve that.
Okay. And then in terms of tooling, obviously the survey has been a kind of the default sort of tooling that, researchers have used for a very long time. What sorts of things do you see now and in the future that are going to be great for the world of UX research? Yeah,
I think one thing I would say about surveys is that lots of times people fill out surveys because they want to complain about something.
That's true.
So you have to kind of take that a little bit with a grain of salt sometimes, that, especially these surveys that pop up when you're 2 seconds into an application, you don't really know a whole lot about it, or they find the feedback button because they want to complain about it. Working in the health insurance industry, we see that a lot with people complaining about that sort of thing. In terms of other mechanisms for research, we've used a little bit of the online services, some of the online services where you can create a test plan, have people come in and do the research. I think you can get a good high level understanding of some of the things that happen there, but you don't get that individual one-on-one relationship with the person. Mm-hmm. You can't see their body language. It's hard to get into some of the deeper questions that will surface as a result of that. Mm-hmm. We also do heuristic analysis, so that's more of an expert review without talking to actual people.
Okay. And then, so in the future, though, do you see anything different in the future? I mean, the way that technology is going, VR, AR, all that sort of stuff, is that all going to have an impact on the work that you do?
Oh, I think it's going to have a huge impact on it. It's just going to create a more complicated interface in a lot of ways. And even though it seems like it's going to be simpler, I think there's going to be more complexity about the relationship that you're having with whoever it is that's producing whatever you're looking at. I do think that there's some opportunities in the future, though, for doing more video usability work, where you've got the person in front of you, they're on camera, and you're able to do it more remotely that way. We haven't done a whole lot of that to date, because there tends to be technology issues with the respondent. So the last thing you want to do in a 1-hour research session is spend the first 20 minutes trying to get the camera to work.
With, that happens in almost most meetings I'm in as it is.
Right.
So, let alone, like you're saying, to the layman, right?
Yes.
So the next thing I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about we talked about it again, like if I'm in this company or if I'm a startup or whichever, I want to talk about how do I know which types of research are appropriate at which stage, right? So if it's something where I've got an idea for the business, maybe a new line of business, I want to branch out and expand. What types of research do I want to do at that stage, right? Like I've got an idea for some innovation. I'm using air quotes.
Right. Well, I think that there's a couple of ways that you could approach that. One, I think depending upon how baked the concept is, it could be an appropriate thing for a focus group where you would bring in a number of groups, several groups of people to talk to them about the concept and the idea and whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea and what they would change about that. So that to me is, it depends on how far along it is.
Sure.
If the idea is a little bit further along, oftentimes what we do is we call it a concept test. So not a usability test. We're not looking for specifically, whether or not they can complete A, B, and C. It's more that here's this thing that we're going to show you, and there might be 2 or 3 of them. So we might do an ABC version, and which one of these works for you? Which one of these do you, is this something that you would actually use? If it's not, is it something that what would you change about it? So a lot of times what we'll go after is, what would they change to make it different? Where would it provide value? One of the things that you have to be careful of, especially in Minnesota, is the whole Minnesota nice factor.
Yeah.
So you get respondents in there and they don't want to hurt your feelings.
They don't.
So they'll tell you that they're going to want to use it, or they'll tell you all of these good things about it, but in reality, they're
not interested.
They're not interested.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think a good facilitator can sort of glean out or extract from a participant. And I always make it a very big point to make sure that they understand that this is not something that I designed. So whatever you tell me isn't going to hurt my feelings, and that usually helps, or just go and test in New Jersey.
And so, because I'm sure they'll be plenty frank with you.
Yes. On the East Coast or any other coast, they will be perfectly frank with you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's why I go to a place like yours, is because I need that sort of non-bias outside party, right? That even helps the research more in some cases, don't you think?
I think it does hugely help the research, because the facilitator's not going to, we're not going to lead them to something, because we want to make sure that our design was successful. Mm-hmm. We don't have an agenda other than to understand how to make it better. Is really what it is.
Let's talk about another sort of stage. So we talked about the idea of a new business idea, right? How about a startup? How about I'm just hanging out and I've got a cool idea that I'm going to build this app of something, right? Where should I start? What should I do first?
Well, I think you need to understand what it is you're going to make. So trying to clearly define what that is, and then try to define what the future of it might look like. Because what we like to do in that case is to bring in people to say, okay, this is what it is now, but how would you see this evolving into the future, and what business benefit might it have to you? A lot of the clients we work with are business to business clients, so it's more about solving a business problem or a process. Lots of the time.
Okay. That makes sense. John, I alluded to this a little earlier. Building applications versus like marketing stuff is very different in terms of the research and things that need to get done, correct? I mean, is it the same types of activities, but is the research different versus when I'm building sort of my marketing sort of gen versus I'm building the actual tool that I'm marketing?
Well, I think it's very different. It's to think about it this way. It's marketing site usually, or lead generation site, is something that, you're trying to attract somebody to it. They're going through a process. They probably will do that process one or two times, just sort of thinking about the frequency of it. When you're designing a tool that somebody's going to use every single day, it's just a little bit different approach. So a lot of the behind the login types of applications that we use, somebody's going to log into that every day or many times in a day. So the way you position functionality, the way you position directional content, those types of things, once somebody learns how to use the tool, sometimes you got to think about those things getting in the way of their experience. So what we want to try to do is come up with ways that they can turn things off, they can modify the experience in a way that it's going to make the most sense for them in a much different way than a lead generation or marketing site where, you're trying to attract them, you're trying to get them down a certain pathway to that lead.
How would you combine that information though, right? So if it is this marketing site that drives people to sign up for this SaaS product or something, even though these are two different types of research, can you synthesize both of those things together to find new learnings? Or what would be your suggestion if I've got these two sort of data sets, right? One is this is the purchaser and this is the user. How do I find, where's a great way for me to start kind of building
I think actually what I would do is once you have the purchaser, what I would do is talk to the purchaser about their experience going into the process. Okay. Because they've started a relationship. So oftentimes what we'll do is we'll recruit several different types of audiences for something like that. So we'll have we'll have a group of people that has purchased the product. They've gone through the process and maybe it's a certain amount of time has passed since they've, went through the sales process. And then we'll talk to them we'll start first with where they're with the application part. So this is what they're used to using. And then we'll go back and talk to them specifically about the marketing side of it. Then sometimes we'll flip it and talk to people that don't know anything but their prospects. So they're prospect clients, right? So they're the people that they're trying to attract. So then we'll take them through the process, ask them specifically what they would be looking for, why they would come to this site or this client or this application. And then once we get that information, then we'll show them the application, say, this is what you'd get, and then see if it manages their expectations in terms of what they thought they would get.
So I know that over the course of many years, you've done a lot of mentoring, you've hired people and all this different stuff. What are some of the qualities you look for in a user research person? Like when you're kind of evaluating, obviously you're going through the interviewing process and stuff, but what are some of the qualities, characteristics, experiences? Where have you seen people be the most successful?
Well, I would say one of the most important things is the person has to be able to write professionally and well. Because we do a lot of research reports, and we need somebody that can communicate well. So that's one of the big things. Okay. I'm less concerned about whether you can operate, whatever software application it is, because that to me is something that can be taught. Have a good design sensibility and understand interface design and what it really means to design a functional interface versus just an interface. or as I would say, a brochure online, kind of a thing. A lot of functionality. So usually what we're looking for is somebody that understands, or they can think about a lot of different moving parts all at the same time with an application and how it would change.
That's smart. So one of the biggest changes that I've seen happen in the last 10 years, really, is the competition between organizations. So at Foundry, we work a lot with financial institutions, for example, right? And one of the more interesting things that, keeps showing up in research over and over again is that you're not really, from a digital experience, you're not competing with other banks. You're competing with the attention span from social media applications and other things, because it isn't like somebody's in their U.S. Bank app and then they switch over to their Wells Fargo accounts and then switch over to their anchor credit union accounts, right? They're experiencing things on Amazon and these typical sort of purchaser sort of user flows and the way that Instagram works. And then they go and they check their account balance. How do you see the way that digital has changed that sort of landscape and how user research can change with it? Because if you're just going around and asking like, which bank app do you like, even though that's probably not the right question anymore, right? Like, how do you conduct that sort of research and what sort of advice do you give your clients?
Well, I think that especially with applications like Amazon's a really good example to think about. People expect other sites to work that way. And they expect other applications to work the way that Amazon does or whatever, application you're looking at. And lots of times there's a challenge because technically or the requirements that we're working with don't allow that to happen. So what we want to try to look for is ways to make that application as transparent to the user as possible, because it's those distractions that it's not doing what I expected it to do that makes them upset or that makes them switch to a different bank or do something along those lines. Mm-hmm. So looking at trends of how things work, where things are positioned, the type of functionality it is, and have it be somewhat consistent with general processes is a really effective way to do it. A good example of that is we were working on a financial application recently, and most of the users used Excel so they basically extracted all the data out of this application because it was too hard to use, and they put it into Microsoft Excel. Well, and that's where they manipulated all the data. So what do they want? They want the application to behave more like Excel does and have some of the way things are named, the nomenclature that's used there, the processes, even just the way that they can sort and manipulate data. They wanted it in a very similar format.
That isn't something you're going to discover unless you are out asking those questions and talking to those people, right?
Yeah. So, you start to ask them questions about, tell me a little bit about the process that you use. Well, we don't like to use this because we don't trust that it's going to work. So we export everything out to Excel because it's easier. So you start to hear things like that, and you can form some pretty fast opinions about a way to make it more effective, and at least have the information. Even if you can't do what they're asking you to do, you have the information about what they want. So that allows you to at least come up and brainstorm other ideas to get it consistent or closer to what people are looking for.
Well, John, I want to thank you for joining me on the show today. I always learn a lot in our conversations, so I appreciate you taking the time. If I'm interested in finding out more about Crux and John, and where are you most active, where's a great place to go and find out more info?
Well, you could go to cruxcollaborative.com. That's our website. So CRUX collaborative.com.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks again, John. I appreciate you.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Schmidt List. If you want to learn more about how Foundry accelerates innovation, check out foundrymakes.com. And if you'd like me to speak about establishing a growth mindset at your conference or with your team, drop me a note at kurt@foundrymakes.com. Oh, and the next time you're on the internet, head to iTunes and leave the show a review. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, because sharing is caring. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show, and I hope you have a fantastic week.